Coming up on the Men at the Movies podcast, Rob Porter and I discuss The Horse Whisperer. We see how trauma can become a holy invitation to walk with God. But in order to deal with our pain, we must create boundaries in order to create space. And if we can do that, we can become a man like Tom, a man who knows who he is, where he belongs, and what he has to offer. Join us as we discover God's truth in this movie.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being.
Hello and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald, and joining me from the other side of the world once again, a day ahead of us, is Rob Porter. Hey, Rob, how you doing today?
Hello, Paul. Good to be with you again, my friend.
It's really good to be with you. Always enjoy our conversations. We always, even with the 30 minutes we've spent talking, it's like a warm up to get us prepped and ready like you do before a football game, whether it's soccer or football. But we spent some time warming up for our conversation, and that time is just, you guys missed out is what I'm saying on a lot of deep, good stuff.
Yeah, we've kind of done the podcast, really. We just didn't press record.
Right. We're talking about The Horse Whisperer, which came out in 1998. I was kind of surprised it was that long ago. And this is a movie that you've talked about a lot, that you really love. And I have to admit that watching it and then hearing your conversation, your thoughts on it, I wanted it when I went back to pull clips and stuff. I was like, I saw the movie in a whole new light. So Rob, why do you love this movie? Why does this movie resonate so much? And why were you like, oh, this is the one that we need to do next?
Couple of reasons, Paul. One of them was there's something that really struck me when the character Tom Booker, and we'll kind of open up the characters a little bit more shortly. He said something to another character called Grace, which was, "Trust me one more time." And it's become a bit of a daily focus orientation point for me. Trust me one more time today, Rob. Trust me one more time. You can trust me one more time.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one thing, Paul. And a couple of other things is that, and I'm going to recite a quote from The Nature Fix from a lady called Florence Williams. "When the brain is resting from its onslaught of daily tasks, it's making room for something else." I'm curious about excavating this something else, using this film as a vehicle to help take us there. And Sir Ernest Shackleton, who most of us would know as a famous Arctic explorer, he quoted that we had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had reached the naked soul of man. And again, I'm really curious about what it means to remove the veneer of outside things in some of the characters in this film, so that we might learn and be invited into listening deeply to our lives with God. And Paul, we've spoken about the kingdom of heaven. We've spoken about The Last Samurai. And again, it's a bit of a theme going here, but this film is another example of where somebody has entered into a journey and a process. They've come to the end of themselves. They're going through trials and a death and are returning different than before, from death to life. Some might call it the hero's journey. This is just another film that takes a deeper cut at what that looks like.
We talk a lot about the movies we love, the movies, the stories that matter, that really resonate with us, are stories of transformation and revelation. And when you watch this movie, you think the story is about grace. you think she's the one who's being transformed. Her character is changing. She's a young Scarlett Johansson, right? She's the one who undergoes the trauma, the accident. And honestly, I didn't see it again until I went back through with your notes to pull some clips. But it's really Annie, who's played by Kristen Scott Thomas, that is the one who transforms through this movie. She's the one who changes. But as you mentioned, like in our pre-show, you talked about what we see in the beginning of the movie is Annie living from an unhealed traumatic wound of the loss of her father at a very similar age that her own daughter is, that Grace is right now. And who she has become is a direct result of that unhealed trauma. And as we know, through walking through this, through engaging in discipleship and as we talk about this time of excavation where we're removing all the clutter to make space for what God has for us, it's a painful time, right? And typically you don't do that without undergoing trauma. You don't get to that point of transformation without the trauma. And sometimes it takes the trauma to get us there. And so describe what you see in Annie in the beginning of the movie, in the beginning of the film.
This is kind of my observations. And like you, Paul, I took a few cuts at the film and you see things that you didn't see before. And so I watched it again last night and saw a whole heap of things that I didn't see. So here we have, a mum, a high flyer in New York. She's an editor of a magazine. Her marriage is very fragile. Some quotes that I wrote down were, "Just get me what I want. Nothing I can't handle. It's been so long since I've done this, I've forgotten." Annie arrives at work before anyone else. Her family are living in a house somewhere in the country. She's in the city. She's lost her way. Her daughter Grace quotes, she's on her phone for 23 hours a day. She doesn't seem to allow herself to be cared for. She's busy all of the time that it takes her away from seeing where she is and those things that matter most. A couple of other words are, she's not at peace. She doesn't sleep very well.
No. She's
striving, self-determination. Everything's up to me, carrying the weight of the world.
And she's an editor for a magazine, I guess runs the thing in her, as she says, until one day when she doesn't. Right. And I pulled many more clips than we can actually use. Because as I went back through, I'm like, man, that packs a punch. That helps us see who she is. There's a scene in the hospital where she's demanding, the IV bag is run out. And she says, hey, then she tells the nurse, hey, she needs her IV bag changed. And she's like, yeah, she's on the list. We're going to change it out, take care of it. She's like, no, I want it done now. She's like, you have to stay on top of these people while the nurse is in the room. And the husband is apologizing. And I've experienced that where somebody is not handling their anxiety well, takes it out on me as I've been working as the nurse. And the family member will come out and be like, I'm really sorry. And you just have to sort of not personalize it. But you see that. And then her response later is, I'm going to learn their names. She thinks, because on the one hand, you think, well, that shows that she cares about who they are. I think it's just to know who screws up.
Right.
But what I do want to play is the one from the table. So catch you up with the plot of the movie. Grace a young Scarlett Johansson, probably 11, 12-year-old, goes out horseback riding with her best friend in the snow. There's an accident. Judith, her friend, dies. Grace ends up losing her, I believe, the bottom of her right leg. She gets her foot amputated. And Pilgrim, her horse, is seriously injured to the point that they think it would be best to put him down. But in a moment of panic and weakness, Annie can't make a decision in that moment because there's just too much. She's overwhelmed and unable to make a decision, which I thought was an interesting point, interesting pivot, because she is somebody who always makes decisions, who is always in control. But in that moment, she's unable to decide to make the decision whether or not. She's like, if it's a yes or no, it's going to be no. And so they get through the hospital stay and they bring Grace home and they're having dinner the first night. And what you see in these interactions between her and her husband, Robert, played by Sam Neill, and the daughter, Grace, is sort of I think a little bit of a condensed version of the life that they've lived and the pressure that they're all living under.
I meant to tell you, I got those tickets for the Knicks game.
Good.
Want to come, Annie?
No. Why don't you go with a friend, Grace?
Yeah.
You want to eat something else, honey? We can order out something else.
No, I'm just not that hungry, that's all.
Well, you should try to eat anyway. It's the only way you're going to
I
get
said
this.
I wasn't hungry.
You want to watch some television?
I think she should finish
Maybe.
first.
I can't.
Here.
I'm sorry. No, Dad, I got it.
Sorry.
You've got to stop doing that.
What?
Helping her all the time. Running to her every time she trips, anticipating her.
You know, Annie, this didn't just happen to you.
And in that scene, when Grace falls against the table, Annie's immediate response is to smooth out the tablecloth. What does that scene say to you, Rob?
Well, one thought that comes to my mind is there's a powerful moment where Annie looks into the eyes of Pilgrim, and the vet, Liz, the horse lady who's kind of in charge of the stables and the health and well-being of the animals, she kind of says, you know, she's never seen an animal with these injuries. I'd like your permission to put him down. No matter what I do, the horse will never be the same. So in the words of her, you know, this animal is beyond help. And there's a deep connection here, connection to Annie and Robert's marriage, a connection to the healing direction for Grace. There's something deep in Annie, although she can't put words to it, although she doesn't really understand it. It's almost like if Pilgrim gives up, Grace will give up, Annie will give up, the marriage will break down. These threads seem to be quite integrated.
Grace actually will say those same things after she sees Pilgrim and sees, you know, she used to call him her beautiful boy. And when he turns and comes into the light and he's got the big gash on his face and she screams because he's not beautiful anymore. And he's thrashing and angry and unmanageable. But after they get home, Grace tells her mom, she says, I think you should put him down. He's suffering too much. And then you can put me down too.
Right. And we hear later, don't we? We hear later in the film, it's kind of like, Mum, who's going to want me like this? Pilgrim. You know, the connection and the threads are really powerful. Pilgrim's scarred, Grace is scarred. And so we've got this real moment of, do we choose death or do we choose life? It's and we all relate. We can all relate to this. We all go through traumas, as you said earlier, Paul. When we can't escape trauma, trauma is inevitable. And what's really fascinating about this film, as we start to learn more about different characters and where this film heads, is the possibility of going from what looks like the bottom, the darkest well, the darkest tunnel, to even conceive that there's light, to even conceive that it's possible to come out of this, may seem impossible to some of us, to some listeners. And so what we want to go after and what we want to allow for is for God to invite us into a holy invitation to walk with him.
And we're going to get a little bit complicated here, especially when we start looking at Tom Booker, played by Robert Redford. Because in many ways, he is the father. He is the God. He's the catalyst of the movie. He is we see a lot of the aspects of God in his demeanor, in his relationship. We're not, I mean, as they go and sort of get a romantic between Annie and Tom, there's some romantic feelings develop, and to the point where she's ready to leave her family and go with Tom. And we're not commenting on the morality aspect of that. We understand that is obviously not something God would endorse. But there's something in Tom that brings to life Annie and Grace and Pilgrim. And we even see it a little bit with Robert at the end of the movie. And Tom is a man who's gone through his own trauma. We'll discover that his wife left him because his heart was in the open spaces of Montana. Her heart was for the big cities, and they just couldn't meet it. And he suffered his own trauma. What he offers is something that we all crave. And in this movie, I think that craving became sexualized and romanticized, because what Annie was getting from Tom, and in the same way Grace was getting from Tom, was fathering. Because as we find out, Annie's father died. So I want to introduce Tom now with this next clip, because we've seen the trauma. We've sort of heard through who Annie is. This striving, this never stops, this always on the go, always pushing, always wanting to look perfect, searching for perfection. She holds herself and the people around her to an unattainable standard.
And this is also a lady who drove from New York to Montana with a sedated horse and her traumatized daughter because she wouldn't take no for an answer. You know, Tom Booker on the phone said, sorry, I'm not sure you're understanding me properly. This isn't going to work out. No, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to come and see your horse. Good luck to you. And she's just so used to having everything her way that she drove the whole way.
Yeah, and basically saying the force of my will get what I want. Because it's still, as Grace will tell her, it's all about what you want, Mom. You don't care about us. You only care about what you want. You think it's for me, but it's really about you. Which happens, right? Especially through our kids. I've talked many times about watching my sons play football. And by watching them play football, 80% of that is watching them sit on the bench. It's probably a higher percentage of that. And watching them go through it with much more grace and understanding and a concept of team than I experienced, than I even felt. Because in those moments, I go back to my 16-year-old self sitting on the bench and feeling like I could contribute and feeling dismissed and overlooked. And wanting to rise up and fight for my boys, but saying, no, this is, your father's heart is my father's heart for you is that I'm willing to go and talk to the coach, but I also understand that might not be what you want. And so allowing them that the permission, but I still go through that of the trauma that I went through back as a teenager. And we see, I think in a very similar way, Grace's trauma is bringing Annie's trauma back to life of, oh, my father died. I've got to live in a man's world. I can't depend on anybody. This was my world and he's gone now. So I can't depend on anybody else to meet my needs. I have to take care of myself. I have to get it done. I have to, whoever I have to roll over to get it.
And she just hasn't had anybody to help guide her and walk her through her trauma of what she went through. She's been stuck in this matrix of noise ever since, in fact. So she's probably lived with a couple of decades in this trauma, doing damage to those she loves most.
And so she goes to see Tom, the horse whisperer. She sees his name in a magazine. The internet was just starting back then. So she was reading books and periodicals and all this other stuff. They end up sort of engaging in this intensive therapy for Pilgrim and Grace and herself through under the tutelage of Tom. And they have this moment where they're sitting on a porch, and as she's sitting there, her foot's tapping. She can't sit still, and Tom asks her a question that is very revealing on who she is and what drives and motivates her.
What?
Do you ever sit still for just a minute?
Well, you sit still too long in New York and you get renovated. Why is it, Mr. Booker, that sometimes I get the feeling that you're laughing at me?
I don't know. Why?
No. You're supposed to say you're not laughing at me.
Oh, I see. You take care of both sides of the conversation, eh?
It's a man's world, Mr. Booker. Most women have to.
You can call me Tom. Maybe I am laughing a little bit. I figure since you're here, it might be nice to relax into the place a bit.
Well, it's beautiful country. And I could see having some kind of a vacation place, a retreat, but I don't know how you do it full time. Don't you miss the rest of the world?
What's there to miss?
Well, if you've never lived in a city with museums and theater and restaurants and music, well, I can't explain.
Well, does Chicago count?
You lived in Chicago?
That's where I met my wife.
You were married to a woman in Chicago?
Yeah, really, a woman.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't, no, I'm sorry.
I was studying engineering, and she was studying music, the cello. And I once heard her play a Dvorak concerto, and I thought it was the most beautiful piece of music I'd ever heard in my life. So, just who's laughing at who here?
And her response, I think, is very similar to all of us. It might be nice to sit back and live out here, but that's not how life is in the city. That's not how life is in the real world. I remember hearing somebody's story, and he said he spent his whole life working and did some landscaping type business, entertainment type business. And then he stepped away. He sold the company, sold it. And he said it was terrifying because he slowed down enough that he started to hear his own voice.
Oh man, Paul, this is the crux, really. One of the crux of this film. You know, I go back to that quote. When the brain is resting from its onslaught of daily tasks, it's making room for something else. Tom Booker is living from his something else.
Yeah.
Annie is not resting from the onslaught of daily tasks. That's quite clear. And what I love about Tom, a couple of observations here. He helps horses with people problems. Yeah. His emotional intelligence and awareness, he notices, he engages, he knows how to handle himself and the hearts of other people. He looks past Pilgrim's limitations in the belief that something else could be possible. He walks right up to the horse that everyone's quite scared of. It's very unpredictable. And he knows what he's doing. He understands the terrain. He understands the horse. He looks past what society and culture would call out as being a defect and moves towards with strength, acceptance, love. Tom fundamentally believes in Pilgrim, believes in grace, and comes to believe in Annie. He's kind, he's gentle, he's inviting, calling forth, bringing out. One of his quotes that he says is, "This is where I belong. This is who I am." Annie's never had that.
Right.
So looking as the film unfolds as well, Paul, we hear pieces of Annie's story, don't we? And we've come to know that in order to know someone, you do need to know their story. And it turns out, Annie never really had a stable home. She was moving around. Her father was a diplomat, and they moved around the world all the time. So she didn't really have 2 feet on the ground for long enough to know what home felt like. There was movement, and then there was trauma with her dad. Tom has the courage to intervene with Annie. He says things to her like, "From now on, leave your phone somewhere else."
Right.
He creates the boundaries. He begins to invite Annie into a different alternative narrative and story and possibility.
That's really the only way we can create space, is to create boundaries, is to get away from the onslaught of voices to find room for something else. We've moved a lot over the years, and so my mom has a lot of moving wisdom. And whenever you move from, say, a small house to a big house, it feels really big, but you always buy enough furniture to fill it up. It may not be immediate, it may not be overnight, but eventually that small house gets full, or the bigger house gets full. And it's the same thing for us, is our time will get full. I know, because I'm very vigilant with my calendar, and there are still weeks that I'm like, oh, this is going to be a trying couple of weeks, because it could be working, it could be watching my grandson, it could be just a lot of busyness. And to step back and say, well, how can I create that in the moment? How do I create room for the something else? How do I escape the onslaught of the voices to create room for a voice that offers hope, a voice that offers a foundation, something where I can put my feet on the ground and be firm. And I know those days when I don't. I know that
Absolutely.
Right. You become much more like the ship that's driven by the storm, rather than navigating through the storm.
Do you find, Paul, in that, just to pause slightly, because I'm really, it's piqued my interest in terms of, so quite, for people listening to this, your life and my life, we've been talking about Tom and these different characters in a film. If you made room for your life to speak, what would you say? And you do think about how many voices there are out there in the world right now. You have books and podcasts and the news and friends and family, and the list goes on. There's a lot of voices out there. But what would it look like to learn? So instead of quoting everybody else, what about if you learned how to quote yourself? Paul, how do you make room for your life to speak? What does that look like for you? What does that bring up for you? Where do you go with that?
part of reading through the Bible, there was this comment that in like the ESV version, it says, godliness with contentment is great gain. But I read that in the Message. It's basically, it was something along the lines of the joy of simply being yourself with God. And where I find the voices that are attacking me, the onslaught is you're not doing enough. You're wasting your time. You're, even doing this podcast sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
To the point where, I just recently had a physical and my doctor said, you need to exercise. You need to lose about 10 to 15 pounds. Those will be the most impactful to your life over the next 10 to 20 years. And I look at it, I look at my day, I say, okay, well, what am I going to give up in order to spend the time exercising? Because there's other things already that I want to do that are left off my list of getting to done. And when that pressure of, well, you're not doing enough. And really what it flips to, if you were not lazy, if you were hardworking, if you had a good work ethic, you would wake up earlier, you would get started earlier, you would work harder, you would do more. And that pressure can be paralyzing. When what I've spent my last couple of years focusing is, can I be available to my wife? Can I be available to my kids, to my grandkids, to my friends? Because who better to be available for than those people? How can I be a man similar to Tom Booker, who knows who he is, who knows where he belongs, and knows what he has to offer? And what we see in that is, Tom is a man who's not looking to Annie to fill a need.
Mm-hmm. And
he even tries to say, nope, lady, this isn't how it works. I'm not going to work with you. I'm not coming to New York. And even she shows up. He's like, this isn't what I do. But I think her offer intrigued him of saying what he saw was a woman who needed help.
Mm.
And he said, you know what? I think I can help. And as you mentioned, like navigating Grace's emotions. And there was a time when he said, don't come, you'd probably get in the way anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Just the right thing to say to get her to tag along, to another where he's making her drive the truck. And she's like, I can't do it. And he's like, you are doing it. What are you talking about?
That's a beautiful scene. I don't think I can, Grace says, because of her leg, because of her seemingly impossible situation. Tom doesn't even focus on that. And Tom says, it's not a question of if you can, you are. And she begins to drive the car, doesn't she? But it's interesting hearing you there, Paul, because you describe both Annie and Tom, Yeah. And we all relate to that. We all get hard on ourselves. We all sort of think, should I have done? I ought to. And as a friend of ours says, that's a sign of the orphan, not of a beloved son or a beloved daughter who's coming under the loving care of a loving guide. And that's what we see in Tom with his kindness and gentleness. He doesn't muck around. He gets to the point. He's able to speak with authority and skill and care. But it's ultimately life or death.
And there's a scene where Grace is talking about, I envy your mom because she's on the other end of this. She knows how her decisions worked out.
Mm.
And his question was, she's like, I feel like the harder I try, the worse it gets. And he says, why don't you just let it fall? And she says, I can't.
Mm-hmm.
But she does eventually, because she ends up getting fired.
Mm-hmm.
She ends up writing and having that part of her come alive. And for me, right, what would it look like to fall? You know, I needed a new grill because my grill that I have, it's a nice big one because we have big family dinners and stuff. And but I didn't take good care of it over the years. And so the bottom's rusting out. So I ended up with grease on my porch, and I'm like, I think it's time. And I spent hours researching. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as I buy one, I'm immediately second guessing my expenditures. It's like I spent too much. It's not going to work. It's not going to be this dream smoker scenario where everything's going to be awesome. And is that okay? Like, how do we walk with that tension of, hey, what happens if it falls apart? What happens if your daughter gets pregnant? What happens if your son's out drinking and partying? And what happens when these things happen? What happens when the business you started goes under? What happens when your wife leaves or your husband leaves? And what happens when things fall apart? Because I know that feeling of the more I try, the worse it gets. Mm-hmm. That was my experience with my daughter when she was in high school and just graduated. The more I tried to get her attention and get her to engage, the farther she felt. To the point where I was seeing a counselor and sharing with them my frustrations. And he said, okay, if this relationship that she's in with this boy, if everything you said was correct, why would she come to you and say, you are right, Dad? And I realized that I was losing her as one of the things as they talk about in the movie. We're losing her. And now looking at it from this perspective, when Annie says we're losing her and she's freaking out, I think she's again going back to her own younger self, the girl that was there. And that's who's actually being lost, because she has been lost. But it takes this gentle heart. Like, Tom doesn't call her out for sort of assuming all these things about him. He asks questions. He's very kind and compassionate, but he does set boundaries. Don't bring your phone. This is how it's going to work. I'm not asking. And Grace tries to ride again, which is funny because she tries to ride again, but she didn't check with Tom. She's doing it on her own. It doesn't go well, not in a horrible way. She just can't get on the horse. The horse runs away. She ends up in the dirt because something's come alive. But it's interesting that she's not doing it through Tom's guidance and with Tom's support, which we do, right? We try to jump out and try to do stuff before we're ready. Mm-hmm. They find out. Annie gets upset at Grace. And as he's leaving, Tom says, I think don't let her push you away. Because that's Grace's response, because that's Grace's response is to push her mother away. And what we see is for a change, Annie allows things to sort of get out of control by opening herself up and being vulnerable and being true to herself and actually seeing her daughter, really probably for the first time.
Look, I just want to say I think it's great that you're riding again. And I think I know why you needed to do.
Yeah, you know everything.
Stop it. Why won't you let me talk to you? Why are you so angry with me? Whatever I do, it's wrong. Whatever I say, it's wrong.
Yeah, well, now you know how it feels.
Look, I know that I'm hard on you sometimes. And
Right.
I'm sorry if that makes you feel this way. But if I push you, it's only because I'm...
Because if I'm your perfect daughter, that makes you the perfect mother, right?
I don't deserve that. I don't push for me.
I push for you so that you don't spend half your life not knowing where you belong.
Yeah? Well, you've done a great job.
Who's ever gonna want me like this? Who's ever gonna want me like this? Nobody will.
I know it sometimes doesn't seem this way, but I do understand what you're feeling. When I was your age, and when my dad died, I felt like I'd lost everything and I'd be all alone.
Well, it's really powerful, isn't it? How Annie's been around this environment enough where it's been reviving and healing and nourishing and refreshing and comforting and bringing her back to life again. And I think as Annie's being resuscitated, ultimately, she's able to begin to come to the center of Grace, in a way that she's needed from her mum in this time of trauma and pain. She's needed a mum to come to the center, and Annie's been too distracted and too busy, fill in the blank. And now she's seeing things differently. She's beginning to make room for the something else, and that's having a redemptive impact.
Annie had isolated that part of her, because when we go through trauma, those are those moments where we wish they never happened, that make us feel alone and weak, like nobody will ever want you. Like we've talked about this numerous times, this idea that if they really knew me, they would reject me. And that's what Grace is crying in that scene of, who is going to want me like this? And in order to connect with her daughter, Annie has to connect with her pain at that same age. And it's difficult because it's not a place she wants to go. It's a place she spent her whole life moving away from, trying to avoid, trying to forget, trying to control and make sure that never happens again. I will never feel that alone, that out of control, because losing a father has to feel helpless. And so she's like, I'm never going to be helpless again. And what it's done is create a traumatic experience for her husband, who will say, when he shows up, and we'll sort of talk about this. He shows up and he knows something is going on. She's never invited him to visit. She's never said she's missed him. She's very cold. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the movie, they're staying in two different spots. He's out in the country with Grace, and she's in the city at work. He is trying to appease her, trying to, when we talk about Tom as a man who offers his strength without needing anything, I think Robert is the reverse, where he'll say it. I've always known I've loved you more than me. And and he gets to the point. I don't want that anymore. Like, you stay away, you take your time coming back. Because if you're back, I want you back. If you don't want to be here, I don't want you here. And he's actually developed the strength to say that now. Where his success is not dependent on whether she's there. I like to believe that she ended up realizing the value of what she had in a husband like him, who would care for it, because it's a two-way street. He seemed to be a very loving, attentive, caring man, but she didn't value that. She didn't want to make herself vulnerable to that.
Or just didn't see it.
Yeah.
Due to her being in the onslaught of daily tasks. She wasn't able to see clearly what was there all the time. And the film ends, doesn't it, with the hope that she's going back to see something different, to make room for something else in her marriage that's not been there before.
Right.
I love the quote actually from our friend Morgan Schneider at Become Good Soil. He recently wrote a blog, and the intro to the blog really caught my attention. And so he says, suffering is brutal, suffering is lonely, and suffering is a sacred space of masculine initiation. So often, it's through the megaphone of pain that God rouses parts of us long dead and dormant. And we really sort of see that in here. You know, there is real pain and suffering, but as these characters move into it and towards it with a guide, with a shepherd, you realize that the pain, the entering into this pain, is being restored into a whole iceberg of new growth that wasn't there before or seen. So all that to say is, I think in my life, Paul, and I'm sure you'd resonate, it's by entering in. That's the key. It's really like to move towards these things that is the greatest healer. And I can say that because I've been through much pain. And I can say that because I've come out from that pain in a more restored position. Where do you go with that, Paul?
As you were talking about that idea that it's like God uses the megaphone of our pain, because sometimes we don't pay attention. Annie wasn't paying attention until the trauma happened, until the accident happened. And what is my response to pain? I want to avoid it, right? I want to, like, no, I don't want things to fall apart. I don't want things to break down. I don't want this difficulty. And I was reading in 2 Timothy today, and it was the Bible Project did a video, and it talked about how this was Paul's last letter. And he's in jail in Rome. I'm guessing this is his last letter, so it's sort of poignant. He's trying to say his things, but what he says in the letter is, this Christian life is hard. It's not easy to follow Jesus. Jesus didn't offer a comfortable road to walk. You know, you look at the people, oh, let me go bury my dad. Let the dead bury your dead if you don't want to follow me. You know, there's a cost to following Jesus. There's a pain to the Christian life. And the important thing is not to diminish it. You know, as we're starting out here in early 2023, it's easy. I'm going to challenge you to look back at the last year. Write down some of the good memories, the stuff to be thankful for, because I'm sure there's a lot of them. Vacations, conversations, time with friends, maybe success at work, promotions. There could be good stuff. I'm sure there is good stuff. But then look at the flip side. What are those things that you are grieved? What are the traumas that have happened? Where have you lost? And more importantly, where is this inviting you? Because our response to pain, or trauma, we've got three, really four pictures in this movie. We've got Tom, who responded by going home, realizing who he is, and spending time in that quiet space. You've got Pilgrim, the horse, who's lashing out, who's uncontrollable, who's just, you can't get close to him, keeps people at a distance.
Who's beyond help.
Right. And you've got Grace, who feels broken, worthless. I mean, doesn't trauma and failure make you feel like that many times? And then you've got Annie, who takes that trauma and bottles it and drives to what appears to be a successful life. Married with a daughter, a successful businesswoman. But inside, she's just acting out of her brokenness. Because it's when we take both the pain and the joy, and both of those should be an invitation to go closer to the Father. And to say, I feel like I'm fallen. I feel like everything around me is falling. Where are you in this? It's I think Psalm 22. Why have you forsaken me? And this is David writing about God. Why have you forsaken me?
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to say, well, he's being hunted by Saul, or we talk about persecution and actual enemies. And many of us, I would say most of the people listening, don't live in a place where they're having to hide their faith, where they're having to, they're meeting in secret, or if they knew that they were a Christian, they're going to be put to death. But we're still being persecuted when trauma happens. When things come at us that break our hearts, even little pieces of it, that's trauma. And I love that quote, pain is God's megaphone. Where are we going to go with the pain that we've suffered? And what are you going to do with it?
It's a holy facilitator, isn't it? Pain. I think it's an interesting transition as well when we move from a worldview of the world's ending, there's no coming back, to what if this is an opportunity? And what I love about the two quotes that we started with, when the brain is resting from its onslaught of daily tasks, it's making room for something else. If you made room for your life to speak, what would it say? And the other one, which was, we had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had reached the naked soul of man. What might be possible again if we gave permission for our veneers to fall away? What if we choose to trust him one more time? What if we began to recover and believe that we are enough, we have enough, and God is enough?
Well, Rob, thank you for your time with us today and offering up your wisdom once again. It's, as always, been very enjoyable and enriching, and taking me into a deeper connection with God today.
Paul, such an honor to be with you. Really enjoy our conversations.
So this has been Paul McDonald and Rob Porter talking about The Horse Whisperer, and then taking about what lessons we can learn about our own trauma and what we can do with it, and how that actually trauma can lead to our transformation, even as much as we may not want it to. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you join us next time here on the Men at the Movies podcast.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?